Our next speaker is Steve Young. Steve is the chief botanist for the New York Natural Heritage Program. Steve has been studying rare plants and ecological communities on Long Island since 1991. Steve is the author of the online New York Rare Plant Conservation Guides and the New York Rare Plant Status lists. Steve is the founder of the Adirondack Botanical Society and was the LIISMA coordinator from 2010 to 2016. Please welcome Steve Young. Welcome, Steve.
Great. Hi, Bill. Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, hear you great.
Good.
I can see your slides. Looks
Okay,
good.
good. So it's great to be back on Long Island, even though it's virtually. I didn't make it down to Long Island last year. It's the first time in a long time. But I just want to answer Byrne's question about native Phragmites. I only know of one stand of native Phragmites on Long Island, so maybe people will find more. So today, I wanted to start out by talking about the Phragmites and the ecological communities that are affected by Phragmites on Long Island. And the New York Natural Heritage Program, we survey biodiversity around the state, and we concentrate on rare species, animals, plants, and ecological communities. And you can see here a list of ecological communities in LIISMA that are affected by Phragmites. Some not very much, some by a lot. So there's 12 globally rare communities that are affected by it, 2 state rare communities, and then about 10 common communities. So Phragmites has a big effect on a lot of places, a lot of natural areas and communities on Long Island. And today I wanted to concentrate on the those 2 with asterisks there, the coastal plain pond and the coastal plain pond shore. So let's look at some of the coastal plain pond characteristics, and so you can get an idea of what they're like. Of course, they're located on the coastal plain, and they are natural glacial kettle holes. We'll talk about that a little bit more. They have the sandy soils from the outwash of the glaciers, and the ponds are shallow. They're up to 10 meters deep, but they're mostly less than 5 meters deep, and they have these gradually sloping bottoms, which is important for the vegetation. Here's a shot of Crooked Pond, full of water, not much shoreline there. But when the water goes down, and we'll talk about that too, you have larger shorelines and a wide diversity of plants and animals on these coastal plain pond shores. Here you can see some sedges and grasses and some open sand at Crooked Pond, south of Sag Harbor. So when the glaciers melted back at the end of the last glacial period, they left these features called kettle lakes. And these are on the coastal plain. And there's very few places in the United States like this, mainly Cape Cod and Long Island, sometimes called the outer lands, where these kettle lakes occur. And what happened was when the glaciers left, they left some huge blocks of ice within the outwash. And eventually, as the soil built up around them and as they melted, they left these kettle lakes. Here's a shot of Egan's Pond, a pretty round kettle lake south of Crooked Pond near Sag Harbor. Now, what's special about these coastal plain ponds is the water regime. So you can see by this diagram that they do get water from land runoff from the water table and precipitation, but most of their water comes from groundwater flow. You can see here 75% from groundwater flow. So that means when there's a lot of precipitation, a lot of groundwater, the level is high. In drought years, when the groundwater goes down, the water in the ponds also goes down. Here is a shot of the main areas of coastal plain ponds on Long Island. There's 5 main areas. The Pine Barrens east to Sag Harbor. You have the Pine Barrens ponds, the Calverton ponds around the Peconic River headwaters, some around Riverhead, the Flanders ponds, which is mainly Sears Bellows Park, and then the Long Pond Greenbelt south of Sag Harbor, and an outlier there on Chatfield's Hole. There are 70, we have 70 named coastal plain ponds in total on Long Island. Now, there's been a lot of study of these coastal plain ponds starting in the 30s when Graham did this plant succession study at Deep Pond. And those studies continued. And in the 1970s, 1980s, a lot more studies started to be done on the ecology and the plants of the coastal plain ponds. So here you see Eric Lamont there in the blue hat, and Bruce Sorey from Massachusetts and Cape Cod, who studied the coastal plain ponds there. He was a heritage botanist there. There's Rebecca Schneider from Cornell, who did a lot of work on the plant communities and how these vegetation communities worked in these coastal plain ponds. And also Julie Lundgren in New England, and also now with the New York Natural Heritage Program, studying the ecology of the coastal plain ponds. So a lot of work had been done, and what they came up with was the zonation and the different plants and the different zones in these coastal plain ponds. So you have 5 main zones, especially visible when the water goes down. So near the edge of the pond, you have the upper wetland shrub thicket. You can see there with small red maples and black gum, pepperbush, blueberries. Then you get the upper low herbaceous fringe, which is visible a lot of the time, even when the water is high. Then when the water starts to go down, you have a sandy exposed pond bottom. We have more open sand, but a lot of different plants there, grasses, sedges, and rushes mainly. And then the organic exposed pond bottom, when the water goes down, you have a lot of small sedges and forbs that are there in the seed bank waiting for the water to go down. And then in the middle, the permanently flooded zone where you have emergence. Sometimes the ponds dry out completely and you don't have a permanently flooded zone. And these zones go back and forth depending on the water level. So here's an aerial view of Sandy Pond West in the Peconic River headwaters, and you can see these zones here too. The first one is that the shrub zone, then the herbaceous fringe, which is narrow, and there's the sandy, open sandy area, and then the herbaceous organic zone, which is pretty large here. You can see this is taken during a drought, and so there's hardly any water in Sandy Pond here, and that's all herbaceous vegetation. And then the little bit of open water in the middle. So here's an example of the changes that these ponds go through. Here's Linus Pond in the Calverton Ponds area during high water. And the groundwater is high and the water fills the pond. You can see some of that herbaceous zone there at the edge. And then during a dry year, here's the organic herbaceous zone filling the pond with mainly sedges and some rushes also. So you can see what a difference there is between years, a high water year and a low water year. That's what makes these ponds really special. That white zone in the background there, you can see a little bit of Phragmites coming in there. Here's Sandy Pond East in the Calverton Ponds Preserve of the Nature Conservancy. High water year, you can see some water lilies there and some herbaceous plants sticking out. And here's the low water year, Sandy Pond East. mainly some rhynchosporas there, beak sedge, just covering the herbaceous zone there. And so these plants, as I said, can be seed bagged. They can be also stem bagged, so to speak. Some rhizomes will stay alive under the water for years and years between high water and low water. Sometimes you have high water years that last for 10 years and these plants are not visible. And then you'll have 1 year or a few years of low water and they'll be visible and they'll germinate and come out. So this shows why these coastal plain ponds are so special, because they contain just a big diversity of plants and animals. Here you can see that there's 58 rare plant species found in these ponds. 3 of them are globally rare, that Rose coreopsis, globally rare. 10 restricted just to these pond shores in New York. Can't find them anywhere else. 5 of them have become extirpated at the ponds, and there's 5 watch list species. Striped bladderwort is a state rare plant. And we also have a lot of rare animals, reptiles and amphibians, some Lepidoptera, 3 globally rare Lepidoptera, a fish species, and again, dragonflies and damselflies, 2 of them globally rare. And if you compare that 58 plant species and those rare animals to other communities around the state, for example, on the lower left there, you see a list of pitch pine forests, rich fens, limestone woodlands, all those communities and the number of rare plants they have. The closest we come to the coastal plain ponds is that pitch pine forest. There are 38 rare species. So the coastal plain ponds really have the most rare species in the state, and these need to be preserved. Now, these ponds have been here, of course, for thousands of years, and the Native Americans used them. But once the development started with colonists and railroads and things like that, there were more pressures and more stresses to these ponds. And if we look at this old topo map from 1904, you can see there were more roads around, but not a lot of development here at in Calverton. And if you look at the Swan Pond there towards the lower right and Sandy Pond, you see that they have a little icon there of stripes on them. So what did that mean? Well, here's a closer look. You see the stripes, and that meant that they were cranberry bogs. That was the icon for cranberry bogs. So there was some development of these ponds back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where they were farming cranberries. But this faded out in the 50s and 60s, so they're no longer used for cranberries. And actually, they've recovered pretty well. So you can see here Sandy Pond and Black Pond in the Calverton Ponds Preserve of the Nature Conservancy. This was taken 2017, a very low water year. And you can see when there's no water, you can still see the lines of those cranberry bogs in the pond bottom. Also, here's a early topo map, 1904. You can see that little railroad spur going over to Round Pond, south of Sag Harbor. That was for the ice industry. They used to take ice out of Round Pond and ship it to New York City. And that was a little railroad spur to handle that. So really, though, not a lot of development around these ponds before World War II. Then, starting in the 50s and post-war, we started to see more development happening. So these are comparisons of aerial photographs of Long Pond Greenbelt south of Sag Harbor. You can see 1954 compared to 2017, more development to the northeast of Long Pond and some to the south also. So more stress is happening here with more development, more stress on the groundwater and other things. Here's Lake Panamoka and Deep Pond. Lake Panamoka was developed pretty early. This is a 1961 aerial on the left. Deep Pond, though, became a preservation area, so there wasn't much development around that. And but you can see those fields between Panamoka and Deep Pond became developments. The Boy Scouts became the owner of the Deep Pond area and preserved it there. Here is the Sears Pond area and Sears Bellows Pond. And fortunately, that was protected early on by Suffolk County. So we don't see any development around those ponds. So we'd expect less stress to those natural communities. And also the Calverton ponds, a lot of people were instrumental in protecting them. So they are protected from development. There was some development there. You can see Swan Pond is that big pond on the right. And on the 61 picture, you can see the Cranberry Bogs there. And then a large golf course was developed next to it there. But to the west, most of that land was preserved for these ponds by Suffolk County, DEC, and the Nature Conservancy. So back in the 1980s, the Nature Conservancy started to have concerns about how these ponds were faring. And these were the concerns they had: lowering of the water table, too much lowering of the water table, pumping of groundwater, polluted runoff into the ponds, polluted groundwater, and also ATVs that were starting to become a problem back in the 80s. But with all of our surveys back then, no invasive species were recorded in these ponds. On the right, you can see a graph of the groundwater and what it's been doing since 1978, and it's still a problem. So there you can see in 2018 hit its lowest level ever. But since the 1980s, we've had a lot more stress on these ponds with, here's an example of the ATVs that are getting into some of these areas in the Calverton ponds, creating patterns and probably bringing in invasive seeds from on their tires. And at Crooked Pond, here is Mile a Minute coming in with that's a threatening creeping St. John's wort there, which is a globally rare plant on some of these coastal plain pond shores. There's another one that's just started to show up, bog bulrush, which has shown up here in Linus Pond. We took it out, but this is what it looked like before we took it out. And you can see this is the year that Linus Pond was very low. This is Eric Lamont looking at the plant there. And to the right is that mud there is really the only water that's left in the pond during that low water year. So since the 1980s, and especially recently, over half of the coastal plain ponds now have an invasive mapped. In the 1980s, there were none. So since then, in the last 30 years, we've had these invasives moving in. And you can see by that list, Phragmites is the biggest problem shown up in a lot of the coastal plain ponds. And around the coastal plain ponds, the pine barrens communities which surround them also are under threat by southern pine beetle, oak wilt, and these other Lepidoptera. So what's causing all this? Why has it been increasing problem? Well, it might be a perfect storm of all these factors you can see in the upper right. Habitat fragmentation, which can cause high deer abundance, that soil disturbance with fragmentation and development. We've got excessive nitrogen, which Phragmites likes. More exotic introductions, climate change is happening. People aren't aware of what's happening, and even if they are aware, sometimes they don't do anything about it. We have the end of lag phases in some of these new invasives coming in. We've made the conditions just right for them to start multiplying and getting to critical masses. So in the mid 1990s, we started to try and do something about it and became more aware and started the ad hoc committee on invasive plant management, which turned into the Invasive Plant Council of New York State in 1999. And then in 2005, we had all the prisms were formed. LIISMA was formed in May of 2002 under the Long Island Weed Management Area. Bill Jacobs was instrumental in that. And then along came all the other prisms. So it's just encouraging that we're all these people now that are involved in invasive species management, and I hope we can make some headway. And we are starting to control some of the Phragmites in the coastal plain ponds, but there's a long way to go. Just wanted to show you some of the photographs of Phragmites here in Peasy's Pond, which is in the Peconic River headwaters. You can see the organic zone. This is a low water year, and the sedges and grasses there that are growing in that organic zone, and the Phragmites coming in from the north. And it's, I think the low water years really are an advantage for Phragmites to come in versus the high water years. Here's showing Peasy's Pond and how extensive the Phragmites is there now, all in the northern quadrant of Peasy's Pond. So we're really concerned about that. Here's Linus Pond, which I showed before, high and low water years, and that Phragmites stand at the northern end there. That's also coming in the south end and a little bit in the east. So we're very concerned here for Linus Pond. And then Sandpit Ponds, which was a pond that had been dug out also for sand, but has reverted to more of a coastal plain pond vegetation. This is owned by DEC. There's some Phragmites there in the southeast quadrant that's threatening the rest of that coastal plain pond. And without control of Phragmites and other invasives that are coming into these ponds, this is what you're left with. This is Pine Lake near Middle Island. And you can see it's totally surrounded by Phragmites now. And the only rare species that are left is the rose coreopsis and dwarf bulrush here at the boat launch, where there's a little bit of space that has been made for some of the vegetation. And there's just a few plants left of the rose coreopsis and dwarf bulrush at Pine Lake. So this is what we don't want to happen to the rest of the coastal plain ponds. And we really have to do something soon, or we're going to lose this tremendous amount of biodiversity that we have here on Long Island in those ponds. And I thought I'd end here with a nice sunset taken by Matt Kaland over Crooked Pond in a high water year. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was great. These are amazing habitats, and as you mentioned, some of the most rare species and communities in the state of New York. We have a few minutes for questions. If folks would like to post your questions in the chat for Steve, and then any other questions in resources that we're sharing after the meeting, there'll be email addresses for some of the presenters, and you can always email LIISMA directly and we'll find out. Can you see the chat, Steve? Or I can ask some here. Oh, I can't hear you, Steve. Let's see.
Okay, I got it. How
There you
about
go.
now?
Yep.
What is being done to preserve the rose coreopsis? Well, just by preserving those coastal plain ponds, you're preserving that rose coreopsis, because it's in some of those coastal plain ponds, it's a very common species. So around the shoreline. So by preserving those, keeping the ATVs out and the invasives, you're going to preserve that. Is TNC tackling the invasives in their lands? Well, I don't know. I think you'll have to ask them what their plans are for tackling the. They have some Phragmites in Sandy Pond and Fox Pond. So I haven't heard from them recently what they're doing about it. I haven't seen any gray willow complex in those ponds. Let's see. I don't have any information handy on Fresh Pond right now, but you could email me. I'll put my email in, and maybe we could get some information to you about that.
All right, there's Steve's email address in the chat. All right, thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. Our next presenters are Dr. Jennifer Dean and Lindsay Charlap. Jennifer is the invasive species biologist for the New York Natural Heritage Program. Jennifer provides biological expertise for IMAP invasives, the state invasive species database, and works with partners to strategically address resource protection issues. Lindsay is our LIISMA field project and outreach coordinator. Lindsay previously worked with the Environmental Monitoring and Management Alliance, where she supported a growing network of ecological preserves engaged in coordinated long-term environmental monitoring and management. We have 2 minutes, so we're setting up. And if you're ready, we can go ahead and start. You guys are ready? A minute early?
I'll leave that up to Lindsay. Lindsay, should we go ahead and get started?
Yep, I'm ready to go when you are, Jen.
All right, great.
Go for it. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. All right, so Lindsay and I are going to tag team this. I'm going to talk to you about some of the tools that we've developed to help partners make strategic decisions about invasive species management. And then Lindsay is going to talk about how LIISMA has taken some of these tools and applied them to LIISMA priorities. All right, next slide. And so we're all, of course, well aware that invasive Phragmites is present in LIISMA. This is a screenshot from IMAP Invasives showing the current data, the distribution that we have. And, you know, of course, this most likely underrepresents the population since this is based on observations that have come in. And but even with this, it can seem overwhelming. It is quite widespread. But, of course, we're here to think about where our efforts will have the biggest impact and how we can be strategic about Phragmites on the landscape. All right, next. But first, I wanted to step back for a moment and provide some context for some of the efforts going on across the state. And so we are fortunate here within New York State to have support and coordination for a variety of invasive species programs. Our state agencies, especially the Department of Environmental Conservation, Agriculture and Markets, and state parks have active invasive species programs and help provide support for the PRISMs, which of course extend beyond Long Island. So if you're not aware, there are 8 of these partnerships for regional invasive species managements across New York. And each of these provide a coordinating hub, kind of like Bill and Lindsay do here for Long Island. There's an equivalent across the state in each of these other PRISMs, and they can help with those regionally specific issues on invasive species and help connect those partners there on the ground. There's also an advisory or invasive species council made up of leaders of 9 state agencies, an invasive species advisory committee that helps advise that council, and then a research institute based out of Cornell University, and that helps connect research to those people who are managing on the ground. So being that conduit for those hands-on applications. And then of course, information sharing that's in a centralized platform. All right, next. And for information on biodiversity across the state, the New York Natural Heritage Program provides data and expertise on rare species and natural ecosystems, as well as threats to these. And so, of course, Steve Young just talked about some of the botany work that he's done through the Heritage Program. We also have programs on zoology and ecology. Next. And we also provide the invasive species data management for the state as a threat to those rare species and natural ecosystems. And many of you are familiar with IMAP invasives, but we also provide other data resources for invasive species. So the Watercraft Inspection Steward Program application, that data is managed by the Heritage Program. And also we use quite a bit of this information, both from the invasive species data and from the Heritage Program to create spatial models to help our managers and our partners prioritize invasive species work. Next. And IMAP Invasive serves as the New York State's centralized invasive species database. We work closely with state agencies and our PRISM partners and of course other partners and the general public that are concerned with invasive species issues across the state. We provide reporting tools to then create distribution maps for invasive species. There are early detection alerts that are very useful for managers who need to know when something new is coming in. We have web map services that provides a live link of the data that people can integrate into their own applications or websites. And then of course, there's ways to track control efforts and the results of those control efforts. Next. And we've been aggregating data within IMAP invasives for the state since 2010. So there's close to 250,000 records within the system for about 400 species of plants and animals. And this, of course, can also be quite overwhelming too. When you have this large amount of observation and treatment data and not detected records, how do you weed through that, pardon the pun, to really get at ways to think strategically about a particular species or location that you're working on. All right, next. And so our resource managers that are dealing with invasive species, of course, know that they must be strategic. There's never enough time in the day to address every issue. So we're often looking at invasive species decisions or management decisions through different lenses. Can we reduce those pathways of invasion? What species should we be targeting first? And what locations or where our control efforts have the biggest impact? Next. And all these together are overlapping, create our projects. We're working, say, on a particular species at a particular location or a particular pathway. And so I'm going to talk about most of these. I'm not going to cover pathways. There are, of course, many great legislative or rules and so forth, and to help reduce pathways of invasion, at the state level and federal level. And of course, there's education and outreach on the regional level. But I'm going to focus in on the species and location components and how those tie together into projects. Right, next. So one way that we've been looking at how to prioritize species, which species we should be working on and how we approach those species is by creating a species tier system that we've been using with the PRISMs and at the statewide level. And so this is a way to create locally specific invasive species list using a standardized process. And then this actually came across or came together a few years ago when Steve Young and I started discussing the fact that each prism had a different way of creating invasive species list and different terminologies that they were using. So it was really hard to say compare what species are a certain threat level to, say, Western New York versus Long Island. And so this way we could have a streamlined set of definitions, and then each prism would have a different suite of species, of course, within these lists. And if you could hit next twice, I'll just go ahead and pop up the axes descriptions. So these are based on, you can see on the x-axis there, the impacts. So in order for a species to be considered on this, it has to have, first of all, very high or high impact, either determined by the New York State invasiveness assessments or expert opinion, which of course those invasiveness assessments are also derived from. And then once a species is determined it has enough of a negative impact to be on the tier list, and then which tier they fall into is based on factors such as abundance and control options. And of course, quite a bit of expert opinion and is also weighed in there because even though we have quite a bit of data, the data can never tell the complete story. There's so much local expertise that managers know just from being on the ground. And so starting with that left-hand tier 1 box, those are the species that are not yet in LIISMA, but pose a direct threat. They might be within a certain buffer around the prism or, northeast United States and likely to invade the habitats within LIISMA. Whereas tier 2 are species that are newly introduced and low abundance. And so these are species that may still have may still be feasible to eliminate from the prism. Once a species is higher abundance, then eradication project could be feasible. Then this falls into a containment category where you may be able to still slow the spread, even though you might not be able to get rid of that species completely. And then those tier 4 species are the ones that are well established on the landscape. I mean, of course, they're still causing high impacts, but widespread control is not an option. However, localized control is still something that is, definitely considered, especially when you're protecting specific assets. So these rare habitats that Steve Young just talked about, those rare species, those are things, worthy of protection from these tier 4 species. All right, next. And these tiers do fall and kind of line up nicely with the invasion curve. This is kind of a generalized, growth curve of an invasive species from when it's first introduced, and then it, spreads and becomes well established on the landscape. Next. And so while we've been talking about this for 4 or 5 years now, this project really took off about 2 years ago when we were able to bring on a graduate student from SUNY ESF, Dylan Finley, and he was able to actually put GIS processes to this amount of data, the location data and the scores from the invasiveness assessments, to create data tiers that then the experts, within each prism will review. Next. And so this results in the tier list that each prism produces and puts on their website. So the LIISMA tier list showing the different species within each of those boxes can be found on their website. All right, next. So moving on to locations, how do we determine where our invasive species efforts will have the biggest impact? And this can, of course, vary on many different reasons. It could be protected areas, it could be rare species, but you might also be focusing your resources on high-risk areas. You see that photo of a pile of pallets. These distribution centers might be a spot where you want to focus surveys, say. Next. And so at the Heritage Program, we created a spatial model to help our partners prioritize invasive species efforts. And we did this by coupling conservation value with risk of spread. Next. And so we did this by doing compiling spatial data that is available on a statewide level, and that would have some type of influence on invasive species control decisions. We created new synthesis layers that are driven by stakeholder feedback and expected uses. Next. and landed on these three synthesis components: conservation value, protection status, and risk of spread. Next. And so each of these components have, of course, lots of spatial data behind them. And so for the ecological significance part, we relied heavily on the data from the Natural Heritage Program, the rare species locations and element distribution models. Significant communities were a big part of this spatial layer. But we also used proxies of watershed health, so the biological assessment profile, and predicted native mussel richness from other projects. Next. For that protected or natural layer, we use the New York Protected Areas Database, which is a publicly accessible database of protected lands across the state. And we also coupled this with the National Land Cover Database using the natural cover classification. Next. And the third component was that risk of spread. And so we tapped into a data product already produced by the Natural Heritage Program called the Landscape Condition Assessment. And this is basically a footprint or a model of where human infrastructure and human footprints are across the state. So this looks at transportation networks, development, utility corridors, and so forth. And we also included where recreation use is at these natural areas, so boat launches and campgrounds. Next. And when we combine these to create this comprehensive score spatial layer, which is that bottom orange and red yellow map, we weighted these different components based on our advisory group stakeholder feedback. So the ecological significance actually was weighted much more than the other two components. So we had 56% of the weight of the model was from that ecological significance, and about a third of it was risk of spread. Next. And these are, each of these component layers and that comprehensive score are available on our website. We have our nyimapinvasives.org website, which will have a link to this ArcGIS online map. Next. And just a quick snapshot of some of the results from LIISMA. That top green map is the ecological significance component model. And so as you can see, there's lots of ecologically significant areas within Long Island and Staten Island. Those dark green areas indicate areas that scored the highest for ecological significance, many of these rare species and rare communities that Steve Young talked about. And then that bottom map is the comprehensive score, where it coupled the score of the ecological significance with the risk of spread score. Next. All right, so how do you tie all this together, with the species and locations? If you have a project that you're about ready to embark on with a particular species at a particular location, how do you know if that's going to likely be successful? The Nature Conservancy, many years back, created this invasive plant management decision analysis tool that we worked with them on to create an online component of this, so the IPMDAT.org. Next. And essentially, this is a flow chart for species that are known to cause some type of impact or harm. The tool will help you select a general strategy based on the distribution and abundance that is either, say, eradication, indicating it's a species that it's in low abundance and not much of it is in the surrounding landscape, versus on the other end of the spectrum, suppression is a species that is pretty widespread and might be a long-term maintenance program to just essentially suppress that species year after year. And so within that general strategy, the tool will walk you through a list of questions where you need to objectively answer and document, say what are the distribution mechanisms of the plant, how effective are the control mechanisms, what are the risk of non-target impacts, and so forth. And so it gives you a way to evaluate whether this is going to be a successful project, so you know it going into it, and whether or not it's something that might be a long-term maintenance project. Next. All right, and so each of these tools are explained in more detail on our website, the nyimapinvasives.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lindsay so she can talk about the LIISMA applications of these.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you guys at the IMAP Invasives program and the New York Natural Heritage for all the work that you do that supports our network. I'm Lindsay, the field Project and Outreach Coordinator with the Long Island Invasive Species Management Area, or LIISMA, your host for the day. And I'm just going to be showing you a real quick example of how we use some of the tools that Jen talked about to prioritize invasive species management within our region. So as Jen mentioned, we are one organization within the PRISM network, and you can see them on the map here. Our mission is to conserve biodiversity, wildlife habitat, recreation resources, scenic quality, and crop production while protecting human health and safety by coordinating a regional response to invasive species on Long Island and Staten Island. Now, there are a few things to note about our region that make it unique and a great place to work and live. So contrary to what you might think when you think of Long Island, there's a lot to protect here in terms of the nature, and Steve Young did a phenomenal job of going into some of that about the coastal plain ponds. Our region is the most diverse area in New York State. We have both coastal communities and freshwater communities and confluences between those two. And we are also home to the Long Island Central Pine Barrens, which includes 55,000 acres of protected area where development is not allowed at all. So there's a lot of natural heritage here. And at the same time, as many of you could imagine, we are very densely populated. And let me just click ahead here. So this is our region. And basically the entire west half of this map is as populated as your average American city. Our region also includes 3 of the 5 New York City boroughs. So there's a lot of exchange, a lot of travel, and as a result, we tend to have a lot of invasive species compared with other regions. So when we look at Phragmites records on IMAP invasives, we basically see Phragmites everywhere where there's wet habitat available. And Jen mentioned that this may be an underestimate of the Phragmites on Long Island, but as it is, each of these dots can represent anywhere from the smaller dots are 10 records, the larger dots are 10,000 or maybe over 10,000 records, and each of those records represents multiple stands most likely. So Phragmites is very widespread on Long Island, and looking at the tier ranking here, we know we have a high impact species. That is, so that puts us up here, sort of on the top of the left axis there, the y-axis, and then on the x-axis we have a very abundant species. So for LIISMA, Phragmites falls squarely into tier 4. Now keep in mind that Phragmites could be ranked differently in another region where it's not so widespread, but here on Long Island it's tier 4. And as Jen mentioned, you can find LIISMA's tier list on our website, and there's the link there. And there are the axis explanations as well. Okay, so Phragmites is a tier 4 species, and we have the definition of that here. So it's a high and very high impact species. It's well established, and eradication at the regional level is not feasible. So what we recommend is to consider localized management to contain, exclude, or suppress. And here's the key part: only if feasible and justified to protect regional conservation targets and to meet conservation management goals. So at LIISMA, these are sort of the questions that we ask ourselves when we're prioritizing sites for management of a tier 4 species. So at LIISMA, our conservation management goals basically center on areas of ecological significance, which Jen spoke about, and our invasive species prevention zones, which are large, relatively uninvaded areas and areas of high quality as well. To a lesser extent, we also prioritize pathways of connectivity to these sites, and we always prioritize protected lands because we want to be sure that resources are going to places that will exist in perpetuity. The ecological analysis comprehensive score does an excellent job of highlighting the areas that we prioritize. And you can see dark shading around, for example, Connecticut State Park and Montauk Point, which are invasive species protection zones, and many sites in the Pine Barrens. And this score also picks up some of the smaller but more significant sites that sometimes get left out of these analyses, like Hempstead Plains in Nassau County, sites in Staten Island, et cetera. So these are the places where Phragmites control and control of tier 4 species should be prioritized if feasible. And the example that I'm going to give you today is, if I can scroll forward here. The example that I'm going to give you today is actually Calverton Ponds, which has come up already today in Steve's presentation. Calverton Ponds is a complex of coastal plain ponds in the Long Island Central Pine Barrens. And there are a few small areas where Phragmites is coming in, but the area as a whole is relatively uninvaded compared to surrounding areas. So in evaluating a location like this, we first ask ourselves whether management would be feasible here. And we think it would be because of the small size of the infestation. The land is protected and there's no easy boat access here. People seem to enjoy the trails more and the view of the ponds. And there are also no duck blinds made of Phragmites, which is an issue that we run into. So the likelihood of frag reintroduction by people is lower than at other sites. And then in terms of what we're trying to protect or restore here, I think I just leave that to Steve and his amazing explanation of, all the rare species in this kind of community. And at this point, again, at Calverton Ponds are relatively uninvaded. So yes, this would be a priority for management compared with other areas in the region. And in fact, Phragmites was managed over there over the summer by DEC. So once you sort of go through this preliminary analysis, that we sort of recommend these simple steps, the IPMDAT analysis can help nail down the details of feasibility of a specific project and the logistics. So Calverton Ponds is a pretty straightforward example, but in most other cases, it's not so easy to decide whether management of a tier 4 species like Phragmites is pragmatic. And the reality is that much of the time, available resources, landowner permission, and community support will dictate what's possible to do. The photo here is of a site that I was surprised to come across in my town. I came there to photograph Phragmites for this webinar and came across this obvious restoration site in an area that I didn't expect. So even though, this particular site isn't one that we would necessarily have recommended for management based on the conservation priorities I talked about, there must have been some local support for conservation here, and that's always wonderful to see as well. The more restoration, the better. Okay, thank you very much. Apologies for technical difficulties. I think we're running a little bit behind on schedule. So feel free to email me or Jen any questions. And if there are questions in the chat, we can answer them there as well.
Yes, thank you, Lindsay and Jennifer. There are a couple of questions in the chat. So while our next presenter is speaking, you can answer those in the chat. We have our next presenter, Tim Simmons. Tim is a conservation ecologist who has spent his career studying and preserving the history, geology, flora, and fauna of northeastern landscapes. Tim brings more than 30 years of experience as Massachusetts State Restoration Ecologist and Land Steward, specializing in imperiled and declining species and their habitats. Please welcome Tim, and we'll bring up your presentation, Tim.
Are you bringing up me or am I?
I can hear you, so we have audio, Tim, and I think you're a co-host, so if you want to just bring your presentation up or share your presentation. There you go. Beautiful.
We good?
We can see it. Perfect.
And you can hear me?
Yes.
Very good.
Yeah, all's good, Tim. Thank you.
All right. Well, if anybody had told me when I was beginning that that other than doing land protection and maintenance of natural areas, instead what I'd spend the next several decades doing was learning how to burn stuff and kill stuff, I wouldn't have believed you. That's where I arrived. You guys have laid some great groundwork for some of what I'm going to talk about. This is a Massachusetts perspective. I'm glad to be back on Long Island, even this way. Look forward to some more time in your region. What we've established, this tier 4 species, invasive species, whatever you want to call it. To me, it's a biological pollutant of extraordinary magnitude. It has the capacity to invade virtually every one of our wetland types, with the exception of maybe open salt water. So we have it everywhere. And it is very, very capable of exploiting disturbances, even small ones. And it becomes a disturbance itself. And its wide tolerance for these environmental conditions make it a challenge for all of us. One of the things that I want to remind everybody is that the biomass of this plant below ground is orders of magnitude greater than it is above ground. So here are some of the natural community types where I have personally been involved in controlling Phragmites, and they include the calcareous fens, acidic fens. The coastal plain ponds, as Steve mentioned, are one of our highest priority communities. We've also done work in freshwater tidal marshes, estuaries, salt marshes, interdural swales, great salt ponds. These are all priority communities because they support an extraordinary abundance of imperiled species in our region. Otherwise, I wouldn't get involved. In the western part of the state, we have two sites for bog turtles, and these calcareous fens also support a plethora of imperiled plants, relatively fragile habitat types. If we had not begun using herbicides in 1998, we'd have lost both our bog turtle sites. There's no question in my mind. In the eastern part of the state, these coastal plain ponds support an abundance of plants like this Plymouth gentian, which you all don't have, and a number of rare odonates that you do share with us. Again, these are habitat types that have to be used very carefully. What we determined, or what I determined over the years, that every time we take an intervention in a natural area, we're doing a risk versus benefits analysis. The previous presenters talked about these site conservation goals. What are you trying to do? You have to know that as explicitly as possible up front. Eradication is almost never possible. I'm sorry to say that every one of our early detection and rapid response attempts has failed completely, and they've jumped over regions where we thought we were going to contain some of them. But you have to balance that with the greatest risk is often doing nothing at all. Doing nothing at all, that Phragmites, the Calverton ponds, is not going to stop. You're not going to stop losing your biodiversity resources by letting Phragmites do its thing. And some of the things we have to think about in terms of the workload of the land steward is what it's going to take to do some of these things, any kind of control, whether it's mechanical, chemical, or other. And starting internally. When I first started talking about the potential for using herbicides to control Phragmites, I first had to get past the directors of nonprofits that I worked for, who were more worried about the impact of their donor base than whether or not we save this natural area. And then you have to the local conservation commissions. Don't know what your regulatory format is in New York, but I'm sure it's somewhat similar. Then we have the State Wetlands Protection Act and the Massachusetts Endangered Species Act, probably the strongest endangered species act in the country. And when necessary, we have to get federal permits for controlling invasives, including Phragmites. Some from the EPA if it's in a tidal wetland, and if it's harboring a federally listed species from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So that looks like a short list, but when you're trying to line all those possibilities up, it's a long list of chores indeed. In Massachusetts, our state Supreme Court has ruled that municipalities have zero authority to regulate pesticide use, because allowing that authority would violate the intent of both the state and federal pesticide acts. And a few years ago, a case that went all the way to land court, they also concurred. It's a terrible idea to have local control over pesticides because the locals, bless their intent, they just don't have the expertise to determine whether or not something is more detrimental than it is beneficial when used properly and legally. But the first thing we always do is look for these effective alternatives. And in a moment, I'll tell you about some of the things that we have tried, but there's no reason for all of you as stewards to repeat the experiments that we did. But here's one case in Falmouth a few years ago. Landowner did not want chemical control, so Wilkinson Ecological tried salt and putting salt into the stems, and it looked absolutely magnificent. By the end of that growing season, everything looked dead. But really all we had done was stress the above ground component. As I mentioned earlier, that's only a portion of the plant. By the next growing season, it was right back to where it started. But we're still looking for alternatives. Some of you may remember that this element stewardship abstract came out in 1993 by Mark Lapin and Randall. And that was turned into a Natural Areas Journal publication. It really does need to be updated, and some of Dr. Blossie's studies have updated some of these efforts. But in terms of what has been tried and what has failed and what has succeeded, this was an early attempt to show that we tried plastic. We tried cutting and cutting and cutting 2 or 3 times a year on small infestations to try to see if we could beat it back, and none of it worked. That's the message of this slide. Is if you can get your hands on the element stewardship abstract online still, even though the TNC's invasive initiative is gone. A lot of those stewardship abstracts remain available. So what we determined in terms of the same thing that previous presenters talked about is that there's a much greater threat to some of our natural areas. Further, what we've determined is that the careful application of herbicides poses little threat when done carefully. And all of this in the context of we're all hoping for an effective magic bullet, which we'll hear about Dr. Blossie's explorations and others later. We'd love to have something that was not a chemical approach. So far, we don't have that. What we've arrived at is that when you combine mechanical treatments with herbicides and fire, when possible, you can make extraordinary headway in controlling these stands when you have permission to do all the above. In Massachusetts, we have a number of different regulatory overlays, and for a lot of years I served on the Utility Rights of Way Management Committee, which is under the our pesticide bureau. And utilities are subject to much higher regulation than any other applicant of herbicides. And so we've categorized with the toxicologist, with a chemist who's within the bureau, the materials that can be used in sensitive areas. And sensitive areas are defined as drinking water supplies, vernal pools, priority habitats, all those things. In order to get approved at the state level, these things, these materials that are already approved at the federal level have to pass the muster of a committee that includes toxicologists and people from our Department of Environmental Protection, our Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, and other entities. And so along the way, they've determined that these three materials and others, and their surfactants have also been through similar review, are within the definition of safe for use in sensitive areas. That doesn't mean all the other regulators will agree that you have the authority and the ability to apply these materials, but ultimately there are some unknowns about the way these materials are going to behave in the environment. So we choose to use as little herbicide as possible, but as much as it's necessary and legal to meet the goals. And that can be as simple as this type of wiping tool, where you can hand apply to individual stems or leaves the foliar application. And it's particularly good for mop-up operations after you've done something at a greater scale. So facing resistance from regulators, one of our sites that had more than 20 conservation targets and natural communities that were imperiled by the invasion of Phragmites. I didn't know at that time that the Attorney General would tell them that they had no right to regulate these materials, but we came up with a compromise. If I did this cut and drip method using a leak-proof Nalgene bottle and clippers, would this be acceptable? And they allowed us to go ahead. This is one of the most tedious ways you'll ever spend a day, an hour, 10 minutes. It takes an awful lot of labor, but it's spill-proof, no non-target effects, and it works. Based on that application method and trying to make it a little less labor intensive, some of our colleagues up here developed the cut, bundle, and wipe application. Same idea, use as little as possible, but you can bundle these things, cut them off, remove the seed heads, and then use an applicator tool such as this and just fill that hollow in the reed, preferably when the nutrients are beginning to go to the root system, to the rhizomes, and deliver that glyphosate or a mixture. We do use take mixes, they're perfectly legal, to the below ground component. It's remarkably successful, but when you go to scale and you start talking about areas that are more than a few acres in size, you need to consider what your other options might be. And we've used mechanical treatment vehicles such as these. The Marshmaster on the right has a relatively delicate footprint, less than the average 165-pound person per square inch. It's very low. It looks like hell shortly after a Marshmaster has been through an area, but the areas recover extremely well, and they allow us to get to infestations that were virtually impossible on foot. You'd be up to your neck wading through these. And on the left is just a mechanical treatment in a gas line right-of-way that borders one of our premier wetland sites, where the utility company was asked by us to control their infestation so it wouldn't continue to invade the wetland nearby. So it's the scale issue is something you always have to consider. The scale of the effort compared to the scale of the infestation was a very hard lesson for us to learn. Throwing the resources we had at some of these early infestations, we found out that the Phragmites was actually spreading faster than the rate at which we could treat the new infestations in the primary core area. Along the way, we also learned that if you suspend operations for even a year or two, you're going to lose the ground that you so painstakingly gained. And to innovate, try to find the best way to do the maximum amount of defending and restoring these areas with the least amount of damage along the way. One of the issues, of course, with some of the alternative treatments, especially multiple mowings per year, is that a lot of these areas just can't handle that kind of repeat pedestrian or mechanical access. So you're actually doing more damage sometimes with the non-chemical treatment than you are with the combined chemical and mechanical treatments. Recently, one of the projects we've been involved with was the careful and selective control of Phragmites in our Great Salt Marsh. This is a salt marsh on the North Shore of Massachusetts, the largest salt marsh north of you guys in Long Island, and under great duress from a variety of different issues, especially sea level rise. But in any case, we determined that there were areas where the high priority for biological diversity conservation, we could do some treatments with the Marsh Master, with backpack pumps and the like. And I know that very recently, some of our colleagues at the Long-Term Ecological Research Station determined that Phragmites is such an amazing absorber of storm energy that they recommended that nobody bother even trying to control this things, because it's this species is providing an extra level of protection to coastal communities from these tropical storms, hurricanes, nor'easters, and the like. What they're missing in that evaluation, of course, is that when you have a place like Calverton Ponds or other coastal plain ponds or a salt marsh, and you completely replace it with Phragmites, you've converted that. It's no longer a mid-Atlantic or New England salt marsh. It's a different vegetation community altogether. And in addition, you're going to lose an extraordinary array of biodiversity dependent on grasses other than Phragmites. So these are times of great social distress over the use of any of the agents I talked about. Glyphosate, Imazapyr. I don't even think Imazapyr is legal for use in New York. Maybe one of your applicators can tell me about that. But I know that one of the operators that works with us up on here on the North Shore has completely stopped responding to RFPs for control in New York State because they wouldn't allow him the use of a tank mix that included both glyphosate and Imazapyr. The difference, of course, is Imazapyr often gets us a 95% control rate per application, whereas glyphosate is more frequently down in the 80s, and the combination is closer to 98%. So we're trying to do the maximum amount of damage to the Phragmites with the least amount of effort and the least amount of chemical. One more sidebar of amusement to some of us and great embarrassment to some of us. I first saw this stand of Phragmites in Burnt, you may remember this, back in 1991, and my field notes said, well, it bears watching. It's in a safe and has Blanding's turtles and a number of rare plants in it. And then close to 10 years later, I saw it rapidly expanding. And this was just before the work that identified the native Phragmites as such. So here we were trying to control this stand of Phragmites, and Tom Rowinski, many of you will know, took a look at the photos from this and said, whoa, wait a minute, that's native Phragmites. He and I went out and verified that. In this case, the lack of the resources to do a complete control operation was the benefit, because we were unable to completely eliminate this particular stand. But guess what? The beavers came in and flooded it, and it's all under 6 feet of water now. And you can't even find a single stem where these people are standing right now. But, first it recovered, and then natural processes sent it in the other direction, and the population went from thousands of stems like this to just a few. So what I wanted to share with you was that we have this nearly universal problem, and it's getting worse every year that we don't do something. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. We have 2 or 3 minutes. If, Tim, you can take a look at the chat. Can you see it?
Yep.
And if there's something in there that you can answer. Otherwise, we'll try to answer later in the chat, and folks can always email.
Okay, the Great Salt Pond, we used that bundle cut and fill method with a high concentration of just salt, very salty water. And the results were, wow, look, we killed it all, but we didn't kill any. So that's what that was. Yes, I will send around a reference for the Phragmites as a buffer sea level rise. And I'm glad to hear imazapyr can be used. You're using imazamox instead because of the less residual and non-target impacts. That's very good. I have to say that we have looked for non-target impacts for all these applications. And when we did find them, they were temporary. There was always recovery of the native community. And along those lines, for a number of years, we always had a contingency for reseeding an area after treatment. But so far, that has never been necessary. It's the native seed bank has responded vigorously every single time.
If I may interject, folks should check the imazapyr in Nassau and Suffolk County. Just make sure. There may be regulations in Nassau and Suffolk County that prohibit it, but I'm not sure if it's that one or a different one. Just something to keep in mind.
The Back Bay Fens question, they tried to pull me into that one because it was a public safety issue as much as a restoration, an ecological restoration issue. People would hide in the Phragmites stands and mug people passing by on public lands. It's too big. If you go back to the last presentation, it's too big an infestation for anybody to tackle now. And so far as we know, there are no imperiled plants and animals that would benefit from that. Chemical control, best timing. Well, if you're using the combination, you can go earlier, July into August. If you're using glyphosate only, you're better off going later when you know the plant is going to be transforming its carbohydrate reserves to the roots. So at our latitude, that is usually August, September, and out on the Cape where things are a little milder into October. The Phragmites that disappeared under beaver impoundment. 17 different beaver impoundments moved in. So that was the issue. Okay, so yes, you need a pesticide permit if used in standing water. That's the same. I promised not to tell too many war stories, but I had to tell you that one about the native frag failed control effort.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. And folks can continue to enter questions in the chat. We're going to take a 10-minute break and be back at 11, which is like an 8-minute break. So we'll start at 11 on herbicides for Phragmites management. So see you in a little bit. Thank you again, Tim.
Thanks.
Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, this is Phragmites Controls, Strategies, Considerations, and Case Studies, a webinar for land managers. If you have any questions, you may enter them into the chat box. To obtain continuing education credit for the webinar, you can fill out the form, which you can find on our website, which we'll put in the chat, LIISMA.org, under the News and Events tab. And I think if you're looking for credits, be prepared to answer some questions of each of the presentations. If you have any other questions, you can email Lindsay, our field project and outreach coordinator. Lindsay will have her email address in the chat. We will be taking a break for lunch at 12:20. So I will introduce our next speaker, Dr. Andy Senesac. Andy has worked for Cornell Cooperative Extension at the Long Island Horticultural Research and Extension Center in Riverhead since 1985. Andy earned an MS and PhD degree at Cornell University in the field of weed science and horticultural crops. His major areas of research are developing weed management strategies for commercial horticultural crop production, landscape, and turf. Andy's program embraces an IPM approach, integrated pest management, including investigating herbicide, biological, and cultural means of weed management. And more recently, Andy has become involved in trying to meet the educational needs of invasive weed issues that affect both production and natural areas. So please welcome Andy Senesac.
Good morning. Let's see if I can get
Good morning, Andy. I can hear you well.
Can you see anything yet? Let's see.
Not yet. There it goes. I can see it.
Are you looking at just the full screen?
It has to go into the presentation mode. I can see the slide, but it has to open up. Slideshow.
Okay, how about that?
I can see it, but it has your notes on the right. It's a split screen.
Huh. All right, I just went into I'm hitting the slideshow button and it's going to full screen for me. Oh wait, I'm sorry.
There you go. That's it.
No, it just went out. It's going out again. All right, how about now?
That's good. Looks good. Just the slide we can see.
We'll go back to the top here.
That's it. Perfect. Thank you.
So thanks, Bill, and I appreciate being asked to speak today briefly about some of the options that might be available to managers for what herbicides can be used available for Long Island use specifically. And I should preface this by saying I haven't ever had a chance to really do any work in Phragmites management, research, or any other. So mostly what I'll be relating today is what I could find information about, and that's mostly what you're interested in is any kind of an IPM approach always starts with finding out what the tools are that are available for managing a problem, and then taking it from there. So I will try to lay some of that stuff out today. One of the things that the first things that you want to do when you're looking for information about any pesticide is go to the DEC portal, which is, I'm going to go through a little bit about, excuse me, I'm just trying to get my screen figured out so I can see what I'm talking about. Okay, there we go. So the portal is a little bit wonky and kind of hard to navigate if you're, as you're looking for things. So I just want to go through this a little bit. So the portal, the first page that comes up is the kind of the easy search, where if you have a product name, you can go ahead and enter it, and it'll pull up all of the products that are labeled in New York State. And so there, if you see there on that page that there are almost 15,000 pesticide products that are labeled in New York State. That's quite a number. But you really have to go to the advanced search to find out really what you're after. And then once you get into the advanced search, then you're either looking for materials that control a particular pest, or if you have a particular active ingredient that you're interested in, you can enter it there. So when I say enter, when you click on that, it's actually a pull down menu of all of the products. So you have to basically work your way through to find the product that you're interested in. And the same is true of the pests. You don't actually type in Phragmites. Phragmites is there, and you click it and select it. And there's also the whether or not it's allowed for use on Suffolk County, which is of utmost importance when you're trying to find out what options there are. So, so there you go, finding Phragmites, and it pulls up a number of products, over hundreds, actually a couple hundred different products that are labeled that have Phragmites on their label. So what out of all those products, basically it boils down to the fact that there are 3 materials that are available for Long Island and New York to manage Phragmites, and they're all post-emergent materials. And although Imazapyr has quite a long residual activity in soil, it doesn't have much in aquatic sites because of its rapid breakdown in water. So each of these have little activity in aquatic sites beyond what the actual application is, and none of them actually have any great selectivity. So desirable vegetation is likely to be injured or killed if sprayed. And even though they are general use in other situations, they're all considered restricted use when aquatic applications are made. And that being said, the DEC permits are going to be needed. So this would be just the first step in figuring out what can be used. And then once you've narrowed things down a bit and decided on a one or two options, then that's when permitting is needs to be seriously considered. So the first one I want to talk about is, sorry, I just got to move this thing out of my way so I can, all right, there we go. Hopefully you can see the screen clearly. I've got all these different windows up on my screen, but so imazamox is the most recently registered material. It's been, I think it's been available for maybe a little under 10 years now. It has a number of trade names, but the most commonly known one is Clearcast. It's an aqueous formulation. It can be used either as a broadcast or spot spray for emergent vegetation. It will control both broadleaf and grass weeds, but so it's not specific to grasses. So even though there are a number of products available, there's only 3 that are actually labeled for aquatic use. And those are all, as I say, all restricted use status. The first one, Clearcast, another is Alligator Imox, and then Agristar, Imoxicast. So those are the 3 available for that material. It's a systemic, it moves through the plant tissue after application and prevents producing an enzyme, ALS, which is abbreviated ALS. And so this whole class of herbicides are known as the ALS inhibitors. And susceptible plants stop growing very soon after application, within hours, but the actual evidence of that doesn't show up sometimes for weeks because of just the way that the plant grows. It doesn't show the evidence of plant death right away. The leaching is very limited, and the breakdown products are not considered herbicidal or hazardous to human health. Both of the 2 products that are in this class are broken down by photolysis, light breakdown once they're exposed. The other material in the same class is called imazapyr. This is an interesting situation where we have a number of products labeled with the active ingredient imazapyr, but there's only one that's labeled for use in aquatic situations, and that's arsenal applicators concentrate. And there are a number of aquatic sites that are labeled, and it's similar to imazamox, and it's applied to fully growing, actively growing green foliage. And all 3 of these materials I'm talking about, generally the best timing for that is mid-season to later season. And I'll get a little bit more into detail later on that. So these other materials, Rotary, Chopper, Kalahari, Lineage, and Polaris, even though on their labels they state aquatic uses are allowed, there's also a further statement that says that no New York State aquatic uses are allowed. So arsenal is the only one there that can be used. So both of these materials, as I said, are in the ALS inhibiting class and group 2. And in both cases, plant death usually is evidenced by reddishness and then followed by total necrosis eventually within days or weeks. So the downside of having both of these materials in the same mode of action group is that resistant biotypes that might develop after one material is being used over a number of years are likely to also be resistant to the other, because that's just the way that these work. We don't really know all the answers about how plants develop resistance to herbicides, but we do know that repeat applications of a herbicide within the same mode of action group year after year is certainly going to select for tolerant or resistant individuals. Okay, and now a third material is glyphosate. This, you can read this, it's very similar in the fact that it's very specifically acting on an enzyme group, an enzyme, I'm sorry, and it also is systemic and works slowly in the sense of the symptoms showing up very slowly. Now, the current status of New York is this. There was recently a law that was passed and signed by the governor in at the beginning of this year, that which bans the use of glyphosate on any state-owned land. Now, there are a few exceptions to this that are working their way through the legislature, and there's nothing official at this point, but the word has it that the exemptions will allow for management of species that are on the prohibited list, and Phragmites is on that list. So stay tuned for more information about that. And the assumption, of course, will be that the no alternatives is available that would allow for glyphosate to be used. If other materials can be used, then they would be the first choice in these situations. It also can be used on a number of different species in a number of different aquatic sites. And all three of these materials work better on the new forming vegetation. The older, more mature vegetation doesn't tend to absorb these post-emergent materials very well. So generally the recommendation is, when possible, to cut the vegetation and then allow regrowth, and then treat the regrowth when it reaches a case of a height of 4 to 5 feet sometimes. Sorry. Okay. So glyphosate has 146 different products that are registered. Most of them are not allowable for aquatic use, but this list here from Accord all the way down to Tomahawk do have aquatic use designation. And there are two double E exemptions. These are federal and state exemptions which allow for either a material to be applied to an unlabeled pest, which is not on the primary label, or a application with an unlabeled method. And in this case, the two double E exemption is for clip and dip. It actually should be maybe clip and drip. As Tim was mentioning, he showed an example of how this is done, but the stem is cut and then injected or dripped into the hollow cavity of each cut stem. Also, wicking and sponge wicking is also allowed for rodeo, I believe, and also Accord.
Andy, we have about a minute.
Okay, just about done.
Okay.
So as far as timing goes, the ideal timing is at seed filling. So this would be at towards the end of the season. And this study looked at 3 different timings: vegetative, flowering, and seed filling, and they found that the most effective for all 3 was at the later stage, but that imazapyr was the most insensitive to timing. In other words, you could make the application earlier and still get good control with the imazapyr, which was not really the case with the other 2 materials. And overall, their efficacy showed that imazapyr was greater than glyphosate and greater than imazamox. And as Tim mentioned also, that the glyphosate can be tank mixed with either of these products to increase the efficacy. And that's probably done quite a bit. So that's about all I have. And I'm happy to, if you have any questions that don't come up in the chat, feel free to send me an email. And I'd be happy to, at least if I don't have the answer, try to find it out for you. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Greatly appreciate your help here. Thank you. And folks can ask questions in the chat, as Andy said, and we'll try to answer them. Let's keep going here to the most difficult part of Phragmites management. Our next presenter is Kevin Jennings. Kevin is a biologist for DEC's Bureau of Ecosystem Health on Long Island. And Kevin manages the Freshwater Wetland Regulatory Program. Kevin has been with DEC for 15 years with both the wildlife and wetland programs. Please welcome Kevin Jennings.
Hi, Bill. Thanks a lot.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen now. Please. Let's see. Okay. So I think everybody should be able to see my screen now in the full view.
Good, Kevin. Yep.
Okay. So thanks again, Bill, for asking me to speak. I'm hoping that this first slide is just a joke for most people. I don't actually believe that the paperwork portion of this should be the most difficult part of Phragmites management. But I do know that people can get some anxiety and feel the dread when they find out that they need a DEC permit. So I'm hoping that by the end of this talk, everyone will feel a little bit more comfortable and know what they need to do in order to get a permit. So I'm hoping that by the end, everyone should know first why we need to get a permit, which I think a lot of people probably have a good understanding of on this call. Also, maybe how to apply for a permit, which some people on the presentation probably have done this before. Also, what type of permit can you get? So there are different types of permits that might work for your project. And then lastly, who can you contact if you have questions about your project and how to get your project through the regulatory process? So I think, as a lot of people know, I got a shot here of just a sort of typical South Shore Long Island creek, 1947, taken from the Suffolk County GIS viewer. And you can see the wetland, and it's impacted by the development already here, but it's pretty widely, it's a pretty open water body, probably some emergent marsh, some shrub swamp, and probably some forested wetlands surrounding that. And then by just a few years later, it gets filled in and developed, and there's a parking lot and stores and houses and all sorts of stuff. And this is typical of sort of the post-war expansion of the suburbs on Long Island. Most of the South Shore creeks had wetlands associated them, which got filled in. And so the wetland systems associated with them got much smaller. And then over the years, people started realizing that, oh, these wetlands actually provide us with some benefits, and just filling them in is not really helpful for the community. And so in 1975, the state passed the Freshwater Wetlands Act. And so this is sort of the reason why you need to get a DEC permit for doing Phragmites management in many instances, not all instances, but we'll talk about that. So obviously there were land use practices that led to the loss of wetlands, filling them in, and the high amount of disturbance leading to invasive species coming in, and just a loss of wetland in general, and a loss of those benefits that were associated with the wetlands. So a lot of these wetlands that got built in also have, whatever exists, some of them do have Phragmites and other invasive issues today. So obviously they identified the need to regulate certain activities that were taking place around wetlands. So the first place to sort of start to see whether or not your project, if you have Phragmites and are looking to manage Phragmites, whether or not your project might need a freshwater wetlands permit. I'm just going to talk about freshwater wetlands. There are tidal wetlands, obviously, and there's different regulatory program. But with freshwater wetlands, DEC went through the process of mapping larger wetlands and then wetlands of unusual local importance, a lot of them like that on Long Island. And so you could find the DEC mapped wetlands on the environmental resource mapper. So you could find that online, put in your address, and come up with the location of whether or not your wetland is a mapped wetland. And if it's a mapped wetland, then you'll be going through the process of getting a permit. If your activity, obviously, your activity that you're looking to do is manage Phragmites, ends up being a regulated activity. So many activities are regulated within DEC regulated wetlands, within the wetland itself and within 100 feet of that wetland. So whether it's construction, grading, placing fill, clearing vegetation, those are all activities that require permits from the DEC in order to go forward with them. If anyone's interested in sort of a broader overview of what the regulated activities are, you could find that at the DEC website at the Freshwater Wetlands Permit Program page. A deep dive into the regulations themselves, 6 NYCRR Part 663. If you Google that, you can get taken to the regulations themselves and sort of do a real in-depth look at what are the regulated activities. But needless to say, Phragmites management, most of the, whether it's clear cutting or pesticides, excavation, is going to be a regulated activity and need a permit from the DEC. So the most basic part of applying for a DEC permit is the form. And for those of you that have done one of these before, it's the joint application form. And if you look for the joint application form on the DEC website, you can find it along with some instructions and along with a list of sort of the basic information that you need to provide when submitting your application. So the basics sort of include, obviously the joint application form, maybe a couple other forms. It requires you to give a project description. It can be a short description or sometimes a much longer narrative, depending on how involved your project is. An important part of that is a site plan, displaying where you're doing the work and the types of work that you plan on doing, and maybe some other critical information as needed when discussed with DEC staff. Photos of the site, a locator map so the permit analyst can find where your location is. A lot of times Phragmites projects, not necessarily at a location with a house, so it's not easy to find. So in order to make that easy, a locator map. And then DEC permits, freshwater wetlands do require a permit fee. But the sort of nuts and bolts of it, which I think where people sort of aren't so sure or get a little flustered, is what's the meat of the application. And obviously when the project gets more complex, there's more documentation on the upfront side, and also more documentation in terms of monitoring and compliance reporting, stuff like that. So I think the first step really is to sort of, as part of any application, is to really discuss what your objectives are. We do see some people who want to get rid of Phragmites because they hear it's invasive and they just want to get rid of it, and they wouldn't mind substituting it with lawn all the way down to their water body or into the wetland. And if that's your objective, it's not likely going to get a permit. So a discussion of what your actual objectives are, whether it's eradication or management, is really important. And considering the long-term goals is also something that really needs to be discussed in terms of how you're going to manage this. Well, I think we all know that Phragmites management is not a one and done kind of project, and does need some follow-up, and it does take time. So any project that comes to us, the sort of outline is to identify the impacts and then to the wetland, and then try to avoid them altogether, minimize them, and then at the very last, mitigate if you can't do the other two. And so that's really, any project should go in with the mindset of, am I avoiding impacts to things that I don't want to impact. So thinking about what else is there besides Phragmites. Are there non-target impacts that I need to look out for? That might require you to do an inventory of the other species that are on the site. So those are definitely things that need to get looked at when putting your application together. It's also important to really go into the specific methods, because each method is going to have its own potential impacts. And so whether you're doing hand cutting or mowing, even up to excavating or dredging, those types of things should be discussed in detail in terms of talking about how you're going to access, where you're going to stage, where the material is going to go afterwards. So all those types of things from sort of the beginning to the end really need to be laid out within the application process so that the impacts can be identified and, like I said, either avoided or minimized or mitigated. And obviously, if the activity is, clear cutting vegetation or getting rid of vegetation, which happens to be Phragmites, there's no avoiding avoiding that potential impact. But obviously, the goal is not to replace Phragmites with, fertilized turf grass. So there should be sort of, that understanding and discussion of that, as we go through the application project. Like I said, avoiding non-target species is really important. So taking a look at the site and figuring out what's there prior to your project, and putting that into your application will go a long way into getting it through the process. For the last bunch of years, we have talked with applicants about a 5-year management plan, and that was really to put people on sometimes these are just individual homeowners, and we really and aren't really sure of or understand the process or the commitment that's involved in doing a Phragmites management plan project. So wanting to get people to understand that this is a commitment, and we want to understand what's going to be done to follow up in the second year, and so on. So we usually try to get people to think 5 years out, and even if it's sort of the same kind of things, like where you treat the first year and then monitor year 2 and sort of do spot treatments, whether you're, let's say you're clear cutting and then in the first year you're getting rid of all the biomass, and then you're herbiciding in the the early fall, late summer, early fall, and then you're coming back and spot treating the next year. Those sort of things should be thought out ahead of time and planned out through the 5 years, so that so the impacts from the project can be considered upfront overall for the length of the permit. So it's good to go in with the mindset of how are we going to do this over the next 5 years, and communicating that in the application process. Lastly, it is kind of important to talk about monitoring. Monitoring so that you can document both successes and failures if needed to sort of modify the protocol and change your approach. But then also just monitoring in terms of compliance with the permit conditions. So making sure that you're in compliance with the permit conditions is an important part of the permit process. And so monitoring whether it's with annual reports or photo documentation, setting up stations where you're taking photographs of the sites before and after treatment. Sometimes, again, depending on the complexity of the project, sometimes it requires doing stem density counts or native plant cover, ground cover of native plant species to sort of see what's happening at the site, again, to sort of be able to adapt your management strategy as you go through. So again, that should be included in part of your management plan. So there are 2 different ways you can go in terms of getting a permit. One, if you have your site and you're the landowner and you're it's all you, and you're just looking to get an individual permit on your own, you can just sort of, and your project is sort of very not unique, but it's just you know what you want to do, and you don't want to be held back by some of the conditions in a general permit. You would apply for your own individual permit, and you could do that through the joint application form. And that is a lengthy process. It requires a fee and sometimes public comment periods and whatnot, and the review can take some time. The idea behind the general permits is to hopefully speed up the process, make it a little easier for people to get through the process. There's a permit already issued, therefore you submit sort of what should be considered minimal information but enough information to sort of track the project and follow up with compliance. And then
I think we lost you, Kevin, for a moment. It looks like you're muted somehow.
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I saw that pop up my screen. And I was like, I didn't change anything, so I wasn't sure that was me. Sorry. I guess you lost me on the permit page, this page right here sometime?
Yep,
Or?
just like 5 seconds ago.
Okay, good. So yeah, so like I was saying, the general permits that are available, there's a statewide general permit that's for all the different DEC regions. And then there was one that was developed a number of years ago that was specific to LIISMA partners that was meant for early detection, rapid response, to sort of allow people to get out there quickly. Obviously, when a new invasive species is at a site, we don't want to wait, months and months and months to get through the permit process in order to get on it and do the removal that's necessary to keep it from becoming well established at a site. So that was developed to sort of keep it small project area, specific species that were part of a list, and but still required. It still required some information that needed to be submitted. But that one, sort of over the years, we've talked to Bill, recently about trying to modify that to fit better with what people want to, how people want to use it. The statewide one is a little more difficult because it is statewide, and it does limit the methods you can use. So both of these really only are limited to hand removal and sort of the less impactful types of projects, so that they can sort of move through the process more quickly. Obviously, the more complex, the more, the different methods like excavation and stuff like that, you start potential for more impacts. So to establish a general permit for that is a little difficult. But there are general permits that could get you through the process if you're looking to do something on a somewhat smaller scale with low impact equipment. That might be right for you, and you might be able to get through the process relatively quickly. And we can work with people. If anyone's interested in looking at that general permit, you can contact me. I can get it to you so you can see what sort of information is required to get coverage under that general permit. And so finally, before we take some questions, I think it's, the DEC is a pretty large organization, and obviously I'm just talking specifically about freshwater wetlands, and my program is responsible for doing the technical review for when it's related to the freshwater wetlands. My program is not the environmental permits program, so we don't issue the permits. So it's important to get, if you, depending on this, your project, you might want to get people from environmental permits on board right away and get your permit in the door. You might want a pre-application meeting to get all the parties from within the DEC involved. Sometimes, you might need review by wildlife. So those are all things that, once it comes to environmental permits, it sort of gets shepherded around so everyone who needs to be involved will get involved. So they're an important point of contact for a project. Obviously, ecosystem health, we used to be called Habitat. You could find that that's me. So you can always reach out to me if you have a project and want to discuss it through. That's fine. We could do that. Any tidal wetlands projects, there's a separate program for marine habitat protection because there are a whole set of regulatory regulations that are separate to the tidal waters of New York. So if you're looking for pesticides, that's another separate process and requires a separate permit if you're doing aquatic pesticides. So again, more complex the project, the sort of more complex the process. So your project, so if it has pesticides and you're looking to apply over open water, you may need a separate permit from that pesticides unit. So they're another resource that you might want to reach out to. And all these contacts can be found at the DEC website, the Region 1 contacts. If you Google NYS DEC Region 1 contacts, you can find each of these programs. the last one being materials management. When, if your project involves dredging, that material could, it involves dredging sediment, it could be considered solid waste. And if it's removed off site, would need some analysis by our materials management unit. So though they might need to be involved as well. So it's really important to think about these things ahead of time and make sure you get everyone on board early on in the process. It is a bit of a process, and so it's good to get, not to sort of plan on, if you come in and say, oh, I'm looking to do my Phragmites management next week or next month or even this season, and you need to go through the permit process, it's probably not going to happen as quickly as you would like. So it's always good to get people on board as quickly as possible. So feel free to reach out to me or find the contacts for many of these programs on our website and reach out as early in the process as possible. So we don't have too much extra time, but if anyone has questions, I could take those questions now.
Thank you, Kevin. It was very informative. And I agree, it's not the most difficult part of controlling Phragmites in freshwater wetlands. There are other difficult parts.
Yes, much more difficult. Don't let the paperwork be the thing that stops you.
And it's a good exercise. Folks should go through the paperwork so they understand what they're doing out there. So it's all good.
Yep, we're here to help.